welcome to this month's edition of The Breeze. We have a very interesting topic today to a lot of us, and that is what happened to us in the 60s. You remember that decade, and I got to tell you, if you were to list all of the things that happened in the 60s, you would have a list of about 10 or 12 items that are just mind-bending, and they all happened in a short period of time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You start with the election of JFK in 60. Youngest president ever. Hope, change, youth,
He was
enthusiasm.
handsome, too, and I really look forward to seeing him when he spoke.
Right, and that was all too short. And then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had the assassination of JFK. We had the assassination of Martin Luther King, RFK, the 68 Democratic Convention. The whole world is watching. And, mixed in there were a couple of things like the Vietnam War. That was a pretty big thing.
Huge, yeah.
We had the moon landing in '69. We had Woodstock.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my God, you could go on and on. The Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
Tina, what was the thing that impacted you the most, do you think?
Well, first of all, I moved from Chicago to LA in '65. That was a major, major culture shock. I mean, the Watts riots were going on. I mean, we were seeing fires as we landed. I mean, it was phenomenal. I was angry. I was amazed. I was afraid. I didn't know what to expect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Margie, you were kind of Midwest, small town. Mm-hmm. Were you isolated, or were you aware of what was going on?
We were aware. We did have evening news.
Back then,
Yeah.
black and white.
We were really aware, and I would say, I was in high school through some of the 60s. And I think the occurrence that I was most afraid of was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
And I remember hearing, the news, and that the Soviet Union had put missiles down in Cuba, ballistic missiles. And I remember the day that we had to do a drill in high school about getting under our desks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I remember I was a sophomore.
That would certainly help.
Oh, my sister was 2 years older. I went to find her to say goodbye. I mean, there's a little drama, too, when you're 16. But it was like the first time I'd really faced something that was really critical and scary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up. I was a child in the 50s, and during the Eisenhower years, everything was okie dokie. I mean, I don't remember anything going wrong. Mm-hmm. Of course, something probably did, but in the 60s, when I was a junior in high school, and somebody comes up and says, "Did you hear the president was shot?" I said, "That can't happen in America. It just can't happen."
Mm-hmm.
And then 2 days later, you're watching TV, and you see Lee Harvey Oswald get assassinated on TV.
Yeah.
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 I mean, it was crazy. But what I want to get at today a little bit is, how did the 60s really affect you and change your life? How did it form or inform your future?
I think it didn't have an impact as to what my life plan was at that point, but I think I felt like it wasn't safe like it used to be.
Okay.
That you didn't have to really put, that when we were asked to do like shelters in our homes and get in a supply of food, and it was like, what is this? Mm-hmm. And I think I remember that our family was extremely concerned and talked about it a lot. Mm-hmm. That incident sort of overwhelmed everything.
Right.
And then when we began to see the assassinations, it was almost like, who can you trust?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Scary times.
I didn't really have an understanding, I think, then of what I know now, and better equipped now to understand it and realize it, because it depended upon what was going on around me and my family. My mother was working, so I didn't really have that day-to-day, oh, this is what happened, an explanation. Mm-hmm. But I do remember getting under the desk. I do remember that we had shelters in Chicago. In LA, LA was just a totally different world. They didn't have the same sense of urgency that they had in Chicago.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, it was always, it was the dreamers, if you will, the people who, oh, I've got a plan, I'm going to get into Hollywood, I mean, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I was bombarded by that kind of environment.
Were they at a point where they were simply denying what was going on and they were all about themselves?
They're about themselves, but I don't even think they realized what was going on.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I meant.
You know, I think for me, I was in college. I started college at 17, and in college I was dealing with racism. One of my first friends that helped me realize that were things going on. I was in a journalism class. He was Jewish, and my professor gave me an F or a D. I don't remember the grade because of my typing skills, not about the content. And my friend spoke up about it, you know, and I was very appreciative of that. But it was like, why are you grading me on something that to me wasn't fair?
So you thought that was racist?
Well, because of the way he responded to my friend
Ah.
as well as to me. It was kind of like,
Well, let me ask you a direct question
yeah.
as opposed to indirect.
Oh, okay.
When the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, all right, did you feel directly impacted, or was that something?
I was a baby. I was 14 years old. I'm not as young as others, so I didn't have the understanding that someone a little older may have who was an
Okay.
adult at 18.
Because I grew up in the Detroit area, as I've said before. In 1967, Detroit burned. They brought in tanks. Were rolling down I-94 into the city to quell the riots. And the race relations then were at an all-time high. I mean,
A divide, a real racial divide.
Yeah, and that's 3 years after the Civil Rights Act. And it was just scary as heck to me because I'd always gone down into Detroit for movies or concerts or whatever as a teenager and never felt worried. And after that particular incident, which lasted a week, I didn't go there anymore. So, you mean, that simple thing.
Simple act, yeah. Well, my stepfather was a businessman. He was an electrical contractor.
Uh-huh.
And he worked with a lot of different ethnicities. And a dear friend who became a college buddy later was a Jewish family. And I do remember when we were going to go visit them, a concern that I had about going over to Bel Air. You know, I do remember in LA they have different housing complexes they call part of the jungle, Baldwin Hills. And it was really like apartments that had the iron gates, and most of them were the same way with a big pool, and then you had 1 or 2, 3 levels, and you had the iron rails around. And we had a fort. We were preparing in case some insurrection that, you know, people were going to be able to defend themselves. I mean, it was
That's great.
it was crazy.
Yeah.
You know, to have to feel that way. It was frightening, you know.
Well, you used the word scare. You were scared. You were concerned. You were frightened. Was there anything positive in the 60s?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm wearing my tie-dye, and it was a liberation era for me because I started wearing the natural. Now, part of that was economics because prior to moving away from home, my affordability was different. I would go to the hairstylist every 2 weeks. Well,
You're
guess
kidding me.
yeah.
Oh my God.
You know, I got my due done. But the
Okay.
thing was, when I got in college and I was young and paying the bills, I had to go natural. So I started wearing the natural and doing my tie-dye. And the big thing for me, I remember, was the Vietnam War.
Okay.
Not only was I liberated, but I was also marching for our soldiers to get out of the Vietnam War. So I made a lot of friends. I became more of an activist during that time. And today,
A lot of people did.
yeah, and I think today I'm still an activist in my own way, and that really impacted me.
Margie, you don't seem like much of an activist, but you probably were.
She's a quiet one.
I probably was not. You know, I still think I lived in this bubble up in the
Okay.
Midwest. And, I said in another program that
She's from Minnesota.
I didn't even know a person of color till I got into college.
Okay.
So it was kind of a whole different scene there, kind of put the fence up and protect yourself.
Right.
And ironically, I met a lot of people like yourself that did not have the black experience. And I had people, and I ended up at the University of Oregon, that came up to me and wanted to get to know me because they didn't have the exposure.
Ah.
It was weird, but
So you exposed yourself to me? Sorry, I misinterpreted that.
I educated them about me.
I got it. Well, I've had a natural all my life, by the way.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, it really looks good. Now, enough of the nonsense here. The biggest concern for me in the late 60s, anyway, I was in college in an Ivy League school in New York, Cornell, and it seemed like every day there was a protest. You were burning your draft card, you were burning your bra, you were protesting the racist society every day. Mm-hmm. Now that affects you in a way. I was not part of those protests, but they affected me in ways that probably still impact my life today. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking.
Yeah.
The outrage, the realization that you could go off to a jungle where you didn't care about the war and get killed. That was what was scary. Mm-hmm. And it was on every male's mind in those years. Mm-hmm. And my personal experience was that I graduated in 1969 and became 1A and got drafted 8 months later. Mm-hmm. I mean, and so, that stuff really happened.
Yeah, yeah.
And the people today in the States don't realize what a critical time that was in a young person's life, and the impact it had on me is it shaped my entire future. Mm-hmm. My entire future. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, you say, well, how did the 60s impact you? And they're all very glib. Oh, man, I don't remember the 60s.
They were stoned out of their
minds.
minds.
Stoned, man.
Yeah.
But that's just a cover-up. Everybody was affected.
Yeah, yeah. I think looking back for me, the activism part became really important when there's certain things that impacted me racially. Mm-hmm. For example, when they were trying to get Martin Luther King's birthday, mm-hmm. I actually marched 2 times in D.C. because I was living in D.C. at the time.
Oh, really?
And I stepped out, I went down to the Capitol, and Stevie Wonder was there, and that became a part of who I became from the 60s. Mm-hmm. I became somebody who, if I felt there was a racial issue, that I would speak up. One of when I got out of college, and that was the early 70s, from U of O, I was working with a company in LA, and one of the agents there said to me that he felt that blacks were genetically inferior.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I took him to task. I said,
well, you should have sued him. That's what you should have.
No, well, they didn't have the same protections then as they do now.
Okay.
But the point was, I was, my early 20s, and I said to him, okay, to myself, I said, I'm going to take you to task. We became good friends. He was a scorekeeper for the LA Kings. He took me to games and stuff. I taught him a lesson. And then I told him, I said, I only can speak and reflect for one person. You need to get to know people for who they are individually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But again, that 60s beginning of activism has continued throughout my life.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, we went out on the street and we actually talked to some of our residents about how the 60s affected them. And we had some really interesting answers, and let's watch.
My family came from the north side of Chicago to the suburbs. So it was a huge, huge leap for them and for all of us. I'd say there was some level of safety and yet some confusion, a lot of changes now looking back. I look at the 60s now and just realized it was a real growing time for our country. A lot of changes in the family have happened since then. I think in some ways it was a more stable time, at least for a small, growing family. Not as much confusion, not as many quick changes until towards the end.
60s were a lot of geopolitical change with communism, the domino effect of communism in various countries. Vietnam War started then. The culture changed as far as morality. And I believe now we're reaping a lot of those negative aspects of that change. And in response, I'd have to say the 60s definitely has shaped our present day culture, as does all history. We have to look back to where we've been to determine where we're going to go.
I'm a child of the 60s, so I grew up in the 60s in Louisiana. My father was a Baptist minister, so we were very active in the civil rights movement, and that encouraged me to just move forward and at all times take a look at what's going on around you and be a part of the improvement of all that's around you. So to bless somebody because you are allowed to live.
The question is basically, did I survive the 60s? And I did survive the 60s. And how did it impact me? Well, I was a Southern California boy, and mostly everything I did was evolved around the beach and surfing. So I really didn't get involved in the political aspect of the 60s, but it was a blast. Took time off from school and became a quasi-bum. Wait a minute, no, I was a bum. I surfed a lot, had a blast, and then I could go off and develop a career in agriculture and had no regrets about passing up the good times.
We talked about a lot of the stuff that were really sensitive issues and bad things. Tell me about some good things in the 60s. Free love, music, what?
Music, definitely music, because American Bandstand was the only platform a lot of us had.
Yeah.
Well, then came Soul Train.
Soul Train.
Soul Train.
Don Cornelius.
Don Cornelius. So all that evolved from that time, and I love to dance. And, you know, I've learned a lot from watching those shows.
So
Well,
did I.
along came the Beatles in 1964, which I think really changed a lot of dynamics in our country.
In what way?
Oh, I think in terms of hairstyle. I think in terms of people kind of uniting around this new rock group, wanting to be like them. I know that the same week that they came to the United States, some kids in our high school put on wigs, and the newspaper came out to show them on their
Oh,
instruments.
sure.
I mean, it was a phenomenon,
Yeah.
is what it was.
I think it changed the whole culture. I really
Yeah.
do. The whole British invasion. Of course, in Detroit, I didn't care. I had Motown.
Oh, yeah.
I had Motown.
Yeah, that's right.
And
that's
they
right.
always put on a free Christmas concert. A free Christmas concert with, you know, the Temptations, Smokey and the
Oh,
Miracles,
yeah.
Tammy Terrell, Marvin Gaye.
They had the Motown reviews that would come to Chicago
Oh, yeah.
at, the Regal Theater.
That was huge.
And I used to go there, and you'd see the Marvelettes, you know, the Shirelles, Marvin Gaye, Gladys Knight,
Did
you
it
know,
give
go
you a
on
whole-
and on and on and on.
Did it give you a whole new sense of freedom?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it
Oh,
did.
yeah.
It
Yeah.
was different.
And there was a bonding, too, because the races, I think, through music began to unite. And it became a common ground.
It did,
You
and
know?
it was positive.
And my
It was-
friends like you learned how to dance.
And I still can dance, girl. But yeah, I think you're right. I think, you know, that and the Summer of Love in 1967 and the whole free love and free association. Drugs came into the picture,
Oh, yeah.
and that liberated a lot of people. It also ruined some people.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was part of life.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
It
we
was.
threw a guy out of our fraternity for smoking dope in 1968.
Yeah, now
Wow.
it's legalized, yeah.
Yeah, now it's
Things
legalized.
changed, yeah.
Things
Better
changed.
stuff, too.
And remember the hippies and the psychedelic clothes that we wore, the tie-dye,
The tie-dye.
the mini skirts, which probably we weren't
I
allowed to.
didn't do many of
You know,
those. I did the hot
I didn't
pants.
either, and I'm not
I
sure
did the
why.
hot pants.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, hot pants. Did
You
you
were-
ever wear hot pants?
Oh, yeah. I'm tempted to say something, but I won't. But
Okay.
let me just say that, yeah, that whole thing was liberating. And in many cases, and many of the people I knew, it opened up our eyes as to what was possible. Rather than
yes,
focusing on
yeah.
our limitations,
Right.
it is possible to make a difference. it is possible to do something besides being a doctor or a lawyer or an Indian chief. It's possible to do something with your life that's important and positive. Well, the 60s were on Larry Kilkoff's alleged mind and his Out of My Mind segment. Here's Larry.
There's something about the 60s, at least that's the premise in this month's Breeze topic. It's one I've heard and considered many times, whether it is from the perspective of social turmoil, protest, and too often violence, to the contemplative, unbounded optimism of the peace and love generation, wafting in the aroma of a beautiful garden of flowers, or other plant-based products. I don't know how anyone who experienced the decade could deny having been profoundly affected by it. But as a teenager growing up smack dab in the middle of the chaos, it was even harder to make sense of most of the time. I went from a 14-year-old 8th grader in 1963, sitting shell-shocked in class watching coverage of President Kennedy's assassination, to the murders of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy a little over 4 years later, which were all but concurrent with my high school graduation. Think about that maturation period for a moment. Meanwhile, I kept hearing about the blossoming social movement known as free love. Hormonally speaking, the timing couldn't have been better. But in my high school, free love seemed to be an awfully scarce commodity, free or not. I couldn't find the registration desk anywhere. Turns out it was at my college, which at least partially explains why I took slightly less than a full academic load each of my 10 semesters. And then there were drugs. I never did any. Not the first lid, tab, or toke. That had less to do with my puritanical upbringing than it did with a well-developed stubbornness about what I put in my mouth. What was true in the 60s still holds true today. I don't smoke, drink, or snort. Heck, I don't even eat Mexican food. But I will tell you this, it was a great time to be a budding journalism student. And one of the strongest influences on my maintaining the required professional ethics of political objectivity was my membership in 2 social peer groups. One consisted of my student journalistic colleagues, many of whom were a hard-drinking, pot-smoking cadre of leftists storming the barricades. The other group was a continuing association from my high school days. They were an equally politically active cult of young Republicans intent on becoming old, rich Republicans and already hard at work, often inside the very barricades being stormed. To paraphrase the Grateful Dead by saying it had been a long, strange trip doesn't quite do it justice. And looking back, I only have one semi-nagging regret. If I had to do it all over again, I think I might run away from home right after high school and go out to California and learn to surf. I would clearly be out of my mind, but it still strikes me as being one of the most beautiful and graceful of sports. Yeah, sometimes I think I should have done that.
And I think here in Sun City, too, that gave us the opportunity to do something different when we actually retired from the job.
That's right.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think too that all these choices gave us, we made a decision, are we going to become our own individual now and step out of our tradition?
Right, right.
And if so, that would be a very brave move to a lot of us who were still in middle school or high school,
Right.
in terms of what we wore, what kind of music we listened to. And I think it might have been hard for our parents to say, "You are not wearing that." but there were a lot of good things. You know, we have to remember that the Peace Corps was created then.
Right.
Did you know the first Walmart was created 1962? That may be of interest to some.
Really?
Zip codes, a lot of good things, but of course they still help us manage our lives, I guess. But I guess in every situation you got to look at the change as being good, and think of all the changes we've come through since. But that 60s era was really, I think, the very, very big change agent.
Do you recall anything that happened in '69?
I got married.
69.
That's a good-
69.
69.
Oh, I don't know, maybe a
69.
moon landing? I don't know.
Oh.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
that's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
I mean, my
Buzz
God.
Aldrin, Neil Armstrong.
Kennedy said we will be on the moon in the next decade, and
Yeah.
he was right. And
Yeah.
nobody believed him.
And guess what? They're trying to get us up to the moon now. They got $1 million trip that you can take and circle up there that's coming up, I think, next year. So definitely the evolution.
Well, I'm canceling my Viking cruise.
You're going to go.
I'll put
Hey, they
that
put
on
on
my
your
bucket
bucket list. There you go. Yeah.
Okay, well, ladies, we could talk for another decade about the 60s, I think.
Yes.
But it impacted us all, whether we knew it or not. It formed our lives
Yes.
and made us make decisions that have carried us through life. And we'll talk some more next month when we again shoot the breeze.
Yes.